Welcome everybody to this open seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. As usual in these times, we're having a hybrid seminar with audience here at the Institute and online. So today, I have the great pleasure to have Moa Bursell, a researcher here at the Institute, researcher in sociology, and her research is about implicit prejudice, implicit bias, ethics of inclusion, inclusion and boundary making in the labor market and in welfare services. And Moa has several projects here at the Institute, and one is what you're going to talk about that, if it's possible to reduce individual implicit bias in organizational settings, a study of social assistant officers. But you also have, I should mention that you have a new project on artificial intelligence in the recruitment process that we also, I guess we will hear more about in the future. And you published several papers in this area of discrimination and how that both in the workplace and in public institutions. So anyway, Moa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. So as Gustav mentioned, I'm a labor market sociologist. I have in my research focused on ethnic inequality and discrimination. And what I've seen in my research is that although discrimination is a problem in Sweden and also in other contexts, we rarely see that employers express any intent whatsoever to discriminate against minority individuals. And this sort of discrepancy is often perceived as a puzzle. People say that, we don't have any problems with minorities, and still we see these persistent patterns of discrimination across contexts. So why is that then? Well, one explanation to this, one frequent explanation, is that this is because of social desirability bias. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with this term, but basically it means that people are reluctant to talk about attitudes that they have that do not correspond with what is politically correct or what is supposed to be the right answer. So basically then we might see this discrepancy between what employers and public officers do and what they say, because people are basically not honest about their attitudes. I think that's one part of the explanation for sure. But I'm also quite convinced that this is not the whole truth. I also think that employers and other gatekeepers, public officers and so forth, are discriminating minority individuals because of implicit bias, because they are not fully aware of all of their behavior or what motivates their behavior in all cases. I think that this is a very reasonable way to sort of explain this gap that we perceive. To some extent, of course, it could be social desirability, but it's also because we're not fully aware of all of our intentions and actions. And this is, of course, a problem in that case, because if people are not aware of that they are discriminating and why they are doing that, how will they change? Even the people who want to change will not change if they don't know about it, right? Fortunately, there is a research field that I've then become increasingly interested in the last couple of years, called implicit bias reduction. So it's a field where primarily psychology researchers are focusing on trying to reduce people's individual implicit bias. And I think this is a very good thing, because if we as researchers can provide people who want to reduce their bias with tools with which they can do that, we can really contribute to improving society. So this is sort of a part of the rationale behind my interest in this project. However, this in many ways very impressive research field, consisting primarily of psychologists, their data is based on lab experiments with university students in almost all cases. And as a sociologist, I am curious about what happens when we try to implement these bias-reducing strategies in other settings, such as real work-life settings, where participants vary in demographic characteristics much more than they do at universities, where they may have variation in motivation, workload, where individuals are acting in organizational cultures, and when they're acting in the type of cultures that typically reproduce ethnic inequality in everyday life. It's not at all for sure that you will have the same results in this very different type of setting. So in my opinion, a real test of whether it is possible to reduce implicit bias is if you take it outside of this university context and apply it in a more real life. Of course, the university is also real life, but in a workplace setting, right? And this is one of the contributions of this study, because I do think that it's a general issue. It's not just for the implicit bias reduction field, but it's a general issue that for all the research conducted in labs, that we typically find something there, and in the article it may say, well, we don't know about how it generalizes across other contexts, but after a while that is forgotten, and we typically talk about these results as if they were applicable to other contexts, although most of the time we just have no idea, because no one ever tries to do this. So this is one of the purposes of my project, to identify and test the most promising implicit bias reduction technique for the implementation in a real work-life context. So implicit bias, for those of you who are not already familiar to this phenomenon, is a non-deliberate, automatic, favorable or unfavorable association, attitude, or stereotype of a social category, such as ethnicity, gender, disability, and so forth. There is a big discussion on whether implicit bias is unconscious or not. I do not personally conceive of implicit bias as unconscious, but rather as automatic or non-deliberate. This may have implications for what type of implicit bias technique you choose. If you're interested, there may be room to discuss this later on. I mentioned that this is a psychology field. Of course, implicit bias is not unheard of for people who are sociologists or anthropologists or philosophers and so forth. In sociology, if you take theorists like Anthony Giddens or Pierre Bourdieu, for instance, they talked about non-discursive and practical consciousness in ways that correspond quite well with the notion of implicit bias already in the 1980s. So this is not unheard of in other disciplines. But what is unique, I think, for psychology is that they have developed tools with which to measure implicit bias empirically. This is where they sort of vastly outcompete all other, I think, social science disciplines in this context. So they were the ones who developed this tool, and in sociology, researchers have been very slow to pick up this trend, to pick up these tools to begin to measure implicit bias. It's been seen as something that you really can't measure in sociology up until really recently. So when this test, and the most well-known test is the implicit association tests, which relies on participant response times to measure implicit attitudes, such as good or bad. And when this test was published in the late 90s, it really revolutionized the study on attitude research because it can avoid social desirability in a very efficient way. And the finding that has received, I think, the most attention is that most people with egalitarian or anti-racist attitudes, explicit attitudes, typically show large or moderate implicit racial attitudes. So there's typically a discrepancy between explicit and implicit attitudes, and this has received a lot of attention. There are thousands of studies that have documented the existence of this type of bias. So it's a very big field and a very very impressive literature on this topic. Importantly for my study is that implicit bias has been shown to be associated with discriminatory behavior. Right? So this is the problem. We see this correspondence between not just explicit attitudes and behavior, but also between implicit bias and behavior. Examples of relationships that has been documented are a correlation between implicit racial bias and resume evaluation, medical treatment decisions, budget allocations to student groups. And there's also a study in the Swedish context where Donald Roth has shown that implicit bias is related to callbacks to job applications by Swedish employers in a field experiment. Again, there's a big discussion about this link. And some critics argue that this link is relatively weak. There's a big meta review that argues that this link is actually pretty weak. At the same time, there's another meta review published the same year that argues that no, it's actually not that weak, and it's still strong enough to be interesting. I'm not studying this link in this presentation or in this study, but this link is of course important for the rationale of why we want to reduce implicit bias, right? So, triggered by these findings of a link between implicit bias and discrimination, a subfield has emerged that has tried to reduce implicit bias in individuals. These are typically psychologists, or I think they're always psychologists, and they have offered a wide range of cognitive training techniques with which you may reduce implicit bias. I can't account for all of them here, but I think that they sort under two main types. One type of exercises that aims at retraining automatic evaluations. So in these exercises, you try to break the link, like the associated paths between the target category in question and the positive and the negative evaluations. So if you have negative associations toward Black people, the exercise aims at trying to break that associative path. In the other type of techniques, they are not targeting the bias itself, but the consequence of the bias. So that they're trying to target the behavior. By trying to prevent biased responding. So by practicing to respond without prejudice, one may increase the likelihood of automatically responding without prejudice in interactions with minorities later on. So these are the two, I think, types of techniques that most of these techniques sort under. These training sessions are typically brief exercises, so-called one-shot interventions. A typical design is that students conduct these students are the participants, and they are randomized into treatment and control. They all take an IIT. Then the treatment group, they conduct the exercise, and afterwards both treatment and control take a new IIT. And the measure for the efficiency of this exercise is of course then the difference between the treatment and control group in IIT change. Right. There are many techniques and many studies documenting that these techniques efficiently reduce implicit bias in direct relation to the training. So immediately after the training, when they take the second IIT, there is a difference between the treatment and the control in the expected direction. Many or several studies at least also document lingering effects of these brief exercises. So the IIT change difference between treatment and control lasts sometimes for 24 hours, sometimes for a week, I think even for 2 weeks in some cases. However, and I think this is important because we want these techniques, these effects to last, right? If they last, it's not so important. However, there was a large study published by Lai and colleagues in 2016, where they evaluated the nine most efficient techniques identified in previous research. And the study was set up as a research contest. So the 9 different techniques were sort of competing, so to speak, on reducing implicit bias in individuals. And there were several research teams involved, and when they conducted this study, it was very transparent and it was a joint research design. But the result of this study was that none of the interventions reduced implicit bias beyond 24 hours. So none of these studies reduced implicit bias with lasting effects. My impression is that the Lai study was a bit of a crisis for the implicit bias reduction field, because several of these techniques had shown lingering effects in the past. And of course, I think that everyone realizes that, I mean, these one-shot techniques are not a vaccine. You can't wipe away, the effects, because, I mean, implicit bias is supposed to be, or is assumed to be, the effect of lifelong socialization. So of course you can't just take all of that away with just like one exercise. But the fact that it didn't last at all, these effects, not even for a day, that was discouraging, I think. At least it was for me. I had just received funding to do this, and then this study came out, right? So, and I was thinking of all these experts can't do this. I mean, my idea was based on, relying on their findings and implementing it in a real life setting, and now they couldn't do it. What was I going to do? But there's always, a continuation, and I continued reading. I found that several researchers have argued that it may still be possible to change implicit bias if you work much harder and for much longer than in these brief sessions, right? Interventions that either expose the participants for something over a longer period of time, or that make participants work much harder to reduce implicit bias for an extended period, has shown lasting effects in implicit bias reduction. So, for instance, there was a natural experiment that took advantage to a random allocation of university students to roommates that showed that having a black roommate in college reduced implicit bias for white students. On a related issue, high exposure to female instructors reduced stereotypes on gender and leadership in undergraduate women. And participating in a semester-long seminar on interracial relations also reduced implicit bias. And another example is that participating in an 8-week implicit bias reduction program really reduced implicit bias 4 and 8 weeks after participation. And I think that this is of course very intuitive. Effects of long-term socialization can only be changed with effort. I think that makes sense. Given my ambition to identify an intervention which is implementable in a real workplace setting, I found the most promising and realistically implementable technique to be the last one here on the slide, participating in an 8-week implicit bias reduction program. This is a program by Patricia Devine. And the reason this is the one that I picked is one of the reasons is that it is designed in a way that makes it possible to present it as on-the-job training course, which none of these other techniques do. I also think that it relies on theories of implicit bias that I feel comfortable with, which is also, of course, reassuring for me. So I chose to implement Patricia Devine's habit-breaking program in real workplace settings. Choosing then an organizational context in which to perform this study, I chose to go with social workers for several reasons. First, they're gatekeepers, so their decisions matter for a lot of people, and they matter for some of the most vulnerable individuals in our society. There is no safety net beyond social assistance. So we really don't want bias in this context, right? Second, I assume that they are motivated to reduce their bias. They are people who have chosen to dedicate their working life to helping people. And it is not a profession where you typically get high wages. So they are really choosing this occupation because they want to do something good for society and for these vulnerable individuals. So I was assuming a high motivation and that they cared about this issue as well. And this is important because Patricia Devine's program, as we will see soon, also hinges on motivation. I also chose to focus, so in this American context where implicit bias is typically reduced, the target category is almost always African Americans. In the Swedish case, I chose Muslims because Muslims is a fairly large group in Sweden. They constitute about 5% of the population. They are visible, and I know from my research and the research of others that they are a group that suffers from discrimination. They are in short a stigmatized minority in the Swedish context. I think trying to understand, to present this briefly and try to give you an understanding of what this habit-breaking program means, I think it might be fruitful to think about it as some type of cognitive behavioral training. It isn't, but I think it has some resemblance to it. The starting point is that implicit bias has been stored in the human mind over a long period of time through the repeated negative exposure to information about the minority group. So if you live in a culture where there is a lot of negative information about a minority group, this information will be stored in your mind, whether you like it or not. And because of this information will be salient, and it is therefore more likely to be activated when you act automatically or non-deliberately without little time to think about what you're doing. And just like with cognitive behavioral training, only repeated training can reduce it. You have to really work with this to sort of counterbalance this situation that you find yourself in a culture where there is structural racism and so forth. So in the Divine study, psychology students, again, first took the IIT, and they were informed about the results. In the training program, for those who were in the treatment group, they were informed about what implicit bias is, how it relates to behavior, and they were also informed about 5 techniques with which we may decrease implicit bias. And these are 5 of these sort of brief one-shot techniques. But in this training program, they were instructed to practice these techniques as often as possible over 8 weeks. So they were not just conducting these at one point, they were instructed to practice them over 8 weeks. In the Divine study, she thereafter measured effects of this training 4 and 8 weeks after the treatment group took the intervention, and the decrease in implicit bias lasted both 4 weeks and 8 weeks after the intervention. In my opinion, these are quite impressive results. She also had a survey with explicit questions, which I will not talk so much about here, but I will get back to some of these measures later because I also used some of them. I call my study a near-replication of Divine's prejudice habit-breaking intervention. I call it near-replication because it is not completely identical. I wanted to stick as closely as possible to it because it worked, but in order to implement it in the Swedish context, and I think in this social work, real work-life context, I had to make some deviations. I think that, of course, as always, this deviation can explain any difference in outcome, of course, between this study and her study. But I also think that for a program to really be generalizable, I think it should hold for some minor adjustments at least. Otherwise, it's not very stable. The main difference, there are also some minor ones that I will not go into these details here, but the main difference, I think, is that because I was thinking about social workers and their workload, it became apparent to me when talking to social workers that they typically have a very high workload. I was worried about that maybe they wouldn't be able to practice for 8 weeks, or maybe not even for 4 weeks. So I decided to measure effects after 14 days instead of 4 weeks. I was just worried that they would just not be able to do this. I do think this was the right decision, as you will see shortly. I also conducted, like I said, typically when you talk about replications, most replications occur in the sense that you replicate the study with the exact same type of participants in the same context. And when you do this, still studies typically often do not replicate, as we know from the replication crisis. So this is a pretty tough test for a theory to take it outside of the context where it's been conducted, and you apply it to another case. In this case, not African Americans, but Muslims in Sweden instead of the US, and with social workers at their workplace instead of university students at university. Still, I think that this is what we typically talk about, like I said before, with generalizability. You want the findings to hold in other contexts, otherwise it's not so interesting, right? Another important difference, I think, is that Divine's participants are self-recruited. They're not just students, they're self-recruited. So they're chosen to participate in this. Whereas these social workers are not self-recruited. So what happened was that I contacted the managers, and the managers agreed to participate. but the social workers did not agree to participate, in a sense. They were assigned this as mandatory on-the-job training. Right. Of course, they participated voluntarily in the research part, in like storing their data. And they were giving all the standard, of course, information about that it's voluntary, that they can they can withdraw their agreement to participate at all times, all of that. But on behalf of the way the manager saw it, this was on-the-job training. So this is a big difference, and it's also a big difference because Devine's study, like I mentioned, it hinges on motivation. However, I do think, I mean, looking back at this study, I do think that many of them were motivated. You know, they care about these issues. But this is also a big difference, and this is what I think these implicit bias reduction program, they often have these type of people in mind. They want people to implement this at workplaces, but they only try them in this lab setting. So my near-replication then of the Devine study looked something like this. Both treatment and control conducted the IIT. The treatment group, we visited them at the workplace. We presented the study, and the participants took the training program. Afterwards, we had a joint discussion, and there were time for questions. And then participants were instructed to practice as much as possible, and that we will conduct a new IIT with them in 2 weeks. So the basic difference, as I mentioned, was that we only measured the effect after 2 weeks, and only on one occasion, not on 2 occasions, as in the Devine study. The Muslim IIT, I want to say a few words about it, because I don't know how many of you who are familiar with how the IIT works. So the logic behind the IIT procedure is that some combinations of social and evaluative categories are perceived as more compatible than others. So when the compatible alternative, Muslim plus bad, is processed faster than the incompatible one, which is then Muslim plus good, this is interpreted as a negative attitude towards, in this case, Muslims. So the IIT result is a relative measure. It measures your evaluations of Muslims compared with your evaluations of another group, like Christians, Swedish names, or whatever. So it's a relative measure, how you evaluate this group compared to that group. In this study, like I already mentioned, we use the evaluative categories good, bad, and the social categories, Muslim and Swedish names. I took this from the internet. This is what it typically looks like if you conduct a racial IIT, for those of you who haven't conducted this test. I think one thing that is important to note about the IIT is that it is a test where you are pushed to perform, to combine the target categories with positively and negatively balanced words as quickly as possible. And this is why it's so difficult to manipulate the IIT to sort of get the result that you want, because you have to do it as quickly as you can, right? And this makes the IT difficult to manipulate. So in this way, it's a really good test because it avoids the social desirability bias. The data consists of 17 social assistant units in Swedish metropolitan areas. 125 out of 224 participants completed the entire study, which gives us a participation rate of 56%. So 44% dropout. 5 Muslims were excluded from the analysis because they received separate instructions from us. We just thought it would be weird for them to try to, or it might be weird for them to try to reduce implicit bias against Muslims. So they were instructed that if they felt awkward about this, they could imagine another stigmatized minority. So basically, I just didn't know what the responses meant. So that's why I excluded them. But the results are not very different whether I include them or not. They're also only 5. 37% men and 63% women in the sample. This is actually a quite high share of men, given the female dominance of social assistants. They are social workers, so of course they are highly educated, and they have in general like I think I mentioned, they also took an explicit survey on 2 occasions, and they all have highly egalitarian, anti-racist explicit values.
Moa, the ones that the percentage here, are that of the people who completed it or the whole group?
Completed it.
Okay. So, and do you have the percentage of when it comes to tertiary education for the ones who dropped out? Or we can.
I did. I have made a dropout analysis. It's not very. There are no big differences. I think men tend to have a slightly lower dropout rate, but it was not statistically significant. But it's in general it wasn't very informative. But it's a valid question though. The mean implicit bias score upon entering the study is 0.46. That doesn't really mean anything to me because it's hard to compare IT scores across tests because the test scores are influenced by things like the valence strength of the words included in the test and so forth. But still, I think in general, my guess is that this is a fairly low score. It's not, at least it's not high. Right. And you should also remember that scores can go below 0 as well, right? You can have a score below 0 if you have implicit bias against Swedish names. So if it's above 0, you have some type of bias against Muslim names. If it's below 0, you have some type of bias against Swedish names, right? So finally then, is there an effect of the intervention? Well, to find out, I'm using a couple of key dependent variables. IT change, like I already mentioned, it's the first IT minus the second IT. I'm also studying some of the explicit measures to see if the intervention improved some of the explicit attitudes of the social workers. In this case, I will be presenting analysis on awareness change concerning prejudice in society, awareness change concerning prejudice at the workplace, and awareness of own implicit bias. And this is only measured in the second survey. The explanatory variable is, of course, treatment versus control. Another thing is that so in the Devine study and in other implicit bias reduction studies where you use students, you randomize the student into treatment and control. Since I'm studying work units, I can't do that because I can't have the work unit has to be either treatment or control. Otherwise, if they talk to each other, it will mess up the study. So a work unit has to be treatment and control, which means then that, and this is a problem in a sense because we know from previous research in sociology and economics that people are not randomly distributed across workplaces, even within the same profession. So depending on your gender or your social class or your ethnicity, you end up at different workplaces even within the same profession, which makes it extra important to control for things like gender, age, education, and so forth, because these are also demographic characteristics that has been shown to correlate with the IIT. So I need controls in this experiment, and more so than in other randomized trials. I also control for IIT experience because it has been shown to be negatively correlated with IIT results. And the data, like I just mentioned, is grouped then on 2 levels. It's grouped in treatment and control, but it's also grouped on work unit. Some may argue that because it's grouped on work unit, we need to control for the grouped nature of the data. So you need to I don't know, you need to somehow account for that because there could be things going on at the workplaces that influence the results, and that is then unobserved to the researcher, right? I have not chosen to do that in this study. I have checked for these kind of effects and they are not there, but because the data set is fairly small, I have chosen to treat the data as pooled. So this means that I have chosen to ignore the grouped nature of the data because I want to reduce the number of controls that I use in the regression. One way to solve the issue with the clusters is to analyze the data as panel data to run the regressions with fixed effects or random effects. That does take this group nature into account. I tried this and it had no effect. And my standard approach when a data set is small is that the simpler the model, the better. So you control for all of these things, and if they don't affect the results, you choose the simpler model. So I have done that. If anyone has doubts about that, or another opinion, I would be happy to discuss that in the discussion. And also my choice to go with a narrow set of controls. Right. So this is table 1 here shows the main outcome of the study. So this is an OLS regression with implicit bias change as the dependent variable. A minus sign for the treatment group, as we have here, means that implicit bias has been reduced compared with the control group. So the results in model 1 show a negative relationship for the treatment group, but the effect is, as you can see, fairly weak and not statistically significant. It doesn't have a star to the right of the result. So the intervention has not reduced implicit bias in the treatment group. It could be mentioned in this context that the significance level of this result is sensitive to what controls you include in the model. So with another set of control, this difference becomes slightly larger and statistically significant. But it is not a stable result, and in my opinion, it's not a result. It's not a significant result, in my opinion. So I'm choosing to present this to you. But I will come back to this later in this presentation. So the main then finding is that the intervention has not reduced implicit bias in the treatment group. In addition, and I think even more importantly, as you can see if you look at the constant term, you can also see that this difference between treatment and control is actually driven by an increase in the control group, which is not the type of effect that we're interested in here. So there's no significant effect of this intervention. We see here then that the control group has actually increased the level of implicit bias by participating in the study. This is not, the effect that we want. Another way of assessing intervention effectiveness is to look at explicit measures. So maybe the intervention did not show decreased implicit bias, but maybe improvement on some explicit measures. This would also be valuable because we know that explicit attitudes are also related to behavior. So an improvement in explicit attitudes could also be, a good result. So if we move on to look at these explicit measures, we can see in these models, I know that I did not present these variables in detail. If you have any questions about what they mean, the dependent variables, I'll be happy to explain that to you. Here we can see that there is no change in awareness of prejudice in society from participating in the intervention. That said, this awareness was very high to begin with, so that's not too surprising in a sense. The social workers were very aware of that there was prejudice in society. The treatment group has, however, become more sensitive to workplace bias, and they've also become more sensitive to their own individual implicit bias by participating in the study. So one takeaway is that the intervention did not reduce bias, implicit bias, but it did induce an increased awareness about both the issue of prejudice at the workplace and about the issue of implicit bias within themselves. One way to go with this is that I could end the presentation right here, but I'm not going to do that because I wanted to look a little bit deeper into the IS score change that I saw in table 1. And when I did that, I did find two things. One thing that I found a bit troubling and one thing that I found a bit encouraging. And I think that both of these findings are worth highlighting for research on implicit bias change going forward. So the second part of my presentation is called Why is there no effect of the intervention? As mentioned earlier, the control group increased the implicit bias score during the study. As I also mentioned, the effect was maybe not significant, but it came pretty close. And why is that? Why would the control group get more prejudiced or get more implicit bias from participating in the study? One, I think, reasonable explanation to this can be derived from the literature on stereotype threat. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with this idea of stereotype threat, but the basic idea is that when a group, when somebody who belongs to a social category, which is believed or known or thought to be worse at something, when you're being told about that, you perform more poorly on this on a test on this. So, for instance, if women are being told that they are bad at math right before conducting a math test, they perform worse than the women who are not being told that they are bad at math. This is a stereotype threat. The IIT test has been shown to be a stereotype threat in some situations in previous research. So there's a study by Franz et al. Where they show that white students who are being informed that white people have implicit racial bias against black people, when they're being informed about this, they perform worse in the sense that they score higher on the IIT compared to white students who do not receive this information. So in some situations, the IIT can be a stereotype threat to white people. In my study, then, why would we observe a stereotype threat here? Well, 75% of the participants had never heard about or conducted an IIT when taking the first IIT test. So they had little information about what the test measured at the first time that they conducted it. So there is a significant difference in knowledge about the IIT between the first and the second occasion. So it is possible then that both treatment and control group perceive the second IIT as a stereotype threat in a way that they did not when they conducted the first test. So there's a risk that the fact that there was so little experience with the IIT in this Swedish setting maybe made this stereotype threat salient to the participant in different ways in the first and the second IIT. If this is what happened, if the participants perceive a stereotype threat at the second IIT, then both groups suffer a threat and they will both increase their IIT scores between time 1 and time 2 as groups. And that would explain the difference. That would explain the increase in the control group. As you can see here, then that could mean that the 0.10 increase could be the effect of the stereotype threat. If this is true, we would observe a similar increase for the treatment group. But the treatment group did not change at all, which then would mean that maybe the intervention was somewhat effective, but the effect was taken out by the increase because of the stereotype threat. Of course, I don't know if this is true, but this is a hypothesis that I'm interested in looking more closely at. Unfortunately, I did not anticipate stereotype threat, so I did not plan to control for this in the design, but I will try to look at this with the data that I've got. Another finding from the Deviations study and from other anti-bias training research is that participants with already low bias are the most susceptible to anti-bias training. This has been put forward as a critique against anti-bias training, that it only works for those it only works for those who care about anti-racism. It doesn't work for those who really need this training the most. And this issue is actually built into the Deviations study, as I mentioned earlier, because it hinges on motivation. If you don't care about that you have implicit bias, you will not try to reduce it, right? So the greatest effect are typically achieved with those who are already committed to anti-racism. My idea here is that the reason why we don't see these effects in this type of study, so in general then, it should be the people with low bias who drive the results. Right, this is the takeaway from this discussion. My idea here is that if stereotype threat is salient, that may influence the effect of motivation in a different way. Those who really care about scoring low on implicit bias test as social workers may be more vulnerable to stereotype threat. So my idea is that maybe this is why the intervention fails. The people who should drive the results are more influenced by stereotype threat. So they don't drive the result in the way that they do in other settings. So in order to test this idea, I have studied IIT change for different subsamples that has different levels of implicit bias upon entering participation in the study. What you see here is the same analysis as in table 1, but for different cutoff points for people upon entering the study. So model 1 is the same analysis as in table 1, but for people who scored lower than 1 on the first IIT. And model 3 and 4 is the same for people who scored lower than 0.7, and then 0.5 and 0.3. And as you may remember, 0.5 was around the average for the participants upon entering the study. And what you can see here is, I think, so the question I ask in these models then is IIT change different for people with different levels of implicit bias upon entering the study? We may begin to look at the constant term across these regressions because these are easier to read. In these regressions, the constant term represents the control group, right? And what you can see here is that the constant term in this model are increasing for each cutoff point. So basically, the lower your first IIT, the higher your increase for the control group. So the lower your initial IIT, the more you increase in the control group. I think that stereotype threat is the most reasonable explanation to this, although I can't prove it. But I think it's the most reasonable explanation. If we look at the treatment group, what we see here is that we also see that the difference between the control group and the treatment group increases for each cutoff point. So the lower your first IIT, the larger the difference between the control group and the treatment group. This is a consequence, of course, of the increase in the control group at these cutoff points, but it's also because there's a genuinely larger discrepancy between the control group and the treatment group, the lower your first IIT. And this is, like I mentioned earlier, this is in line with research showing that interventions work better for those who are already committed to anti-racism. So one way to interpret these findings is that intervention has an effect for those with average or lower levels of implicit bias upon entering participation, but the effect is largely lost because of stereotype threat. That is, the stress of performing poorly. I could also mention in this context that I run a similar set of regressions based on the same idea on some of the explicit measures, and these results were not as convincing, but they were in line with this, which I think also supports this idea. I also threw in, I don't know if I have time to this, but I also threw in in the last survey I added a self-assessed personality test where it's a scale where people score differently on anxiety, creativity, extroversion, caring, and being meticulous. And as you can see here also, anxiety is the only scale which is correlated with IT change. And what you see here then is that the higher you score on anxiety, the higher increase you have on IT change. So this is not a measure of stereotype threat, but it's related because it measures anxiety. So a good question to ask then is, if what we observe here is stereotype threat, which I believe but cannot completely prove, why would we see this in this particular study and not in the Devine study and in other studies on implicit bias reduction? But my sense is that this goes back to exactly what I wanted to do in this study. It has to do with me taking these interventions outside of the lab and implementing them in a real life workplace context. Because maybe it could be a case of motivation. I don't think so. I think that the social workers were genuinely motivated to do this. Not all of them, but I mean, they were motivated. I don't think that it's perhaps the motivation, but I think it's the occupational or the organizational context. I chose social workers because, they gatekeep these resources, and because I thought they would care about this issue. And I think they did. But I think maybe they are simply too uncomfortable participating in a study like this on implicit bias, where they have to perform on this test that is said to measure their unconscious prejudice or their implicit bias. Maybe this was too stressful for them. As a researcher on ethnic discrimination, I can relate to this. It is uncomfortable to conduct these tests when you really care about these issues. Devine had participants, and not just her, I mean all of these psychology studies have participants who were psychology students, well familiar with this technique. They're students at an elite university, and they signed up on a voluntary basis. They chose to do this, right? And maybe you get a sample of people who are maybe not more motivated, but maybe more competitive people who like to challenge themselves, or something like that. People basically who perform better under stress with this type of rather special, I think, voluntary sample. It's a highly selected group of people, and I think that this is important to mention, I think, or to focus on, because these implicit bias reduction techniques has become increasingly popular, also outside of universities, and despite little evidence that they work outside of the research lab. So in anti-bias training, diversity training that companies take, and so forth, these implicit bias reduction techniques are becoming, an increasingly common component. And I think that if we do this wrong, they will either be ineffective, or at worst they will be counterproductive, right? So I think that we need to be aware of this, when we take these studies outside of the lab. So my main takeaways then from this presentation is that, at least during this, when I tried, it was really difficult to reduce implicit bias against Muslims in a real organization. However, it didn't all fail. I mean, learning about implicit bias increased sensitivity to workplace prejudice, which I think is important, because when they're sitting in their meetings, I think it's a good thing that they are increasingly aware of that workplace prejudice can be an issue. So I think that's a good finding. I also think it's an important finding that they became increasingly aware of the fact that implicit bias exists and that they have it. I do think that, as I already mentioned, that stereotype threat impacted the result, especially for those with the medium to low levels of bias. And like I said before, that this is something that we should be aware of when we implement these techniques outside of the university lab. I also think, I mean, going back to Devine's study, and I think in support for previous research, we find that these interventions was more efficient for participants with egalitarian or implicit attitudes upon entering the study compared with the control group. So in one sense, I did find the pattern of people with low biases responding to the treatment better, but this, as I said earlier, this effect was taken out by the stereotype threat. Thank you.